It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speakers. The presentations by Tony Varcoe and Andrew Growcock. Tony's from Parks Victoria in Victoria. Andrew is from the Office of Environment and Heritage in New South Wales. Both have been leading very active programs of State of the Parks reporting and management effectiveness evaluation, now going back over a decade, I think. So lots of experience, and what they're going to give us is some information around the journey that they've taken in terms of improving the quality of data in their assessment systems. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Look, thank you very much for that. Andrew and myself are going to be talking from the perspective of two different states in Australia that are essentially working on a very similar program called State of the Parks. And State of the Parks is really just our way of describing our formal management effectiveness program. What we're going to be talking today is really, I guess, maybe some handy hints about how we can improve the process of data quality in our assessments. In Australia, we often have a saying, rubbish in, rubbish out, and I guess there are a whole range of steps that we need to be thinking about as we go right through the journey of management effectiveness to make sure that we can improve the data quality at each of those steps. And I guess the first point is really being very clear about what those steps are and really needing to build in a quality assurance guidelines, if you like, and improvements into each of those steps. So there are a number of potential risks in terms of the data quality issue for the effectiveness. We often hear, the whole argument qualitative versus quantitative. It's a bit of a non-argument. It's about horses for courses. But really, the key risks that we've thought about in terms of our process are really firstly around making sure that you are able to collect the best available information. There is a lot of information out there, whether that's from the scientific community, from traditional knowledge, from community knowledge, as well as from our park managers. And while the system might be there, the ability to capture that information and share it is a really critical one. So we'll talk a little bit about some ideas that we've got for improving that process. The other one is that there is an enormous amount of data out there, but it often doesn't turn it into knowledge. And so you can have the best monitoring programs, but if it's not actually interpreted, analysed, and then turned into knowledge, it can be a bit useless and gather dust. And so one of the really important things is how do we actually turn the data that we are collecting, and where possible quantitative data, how do you turn that into knowledge that our park managers can actually understand? One of the other key ones is around interpretation. When you are doing these qualitative type assessments, we've got lots of staff involved, we've got lots of other people involved in our assessment processes, and being really clear about the interpretation of the questions is pretty fundamental. One of the other areas is around this whole question about inconsistency and variability, and that's linked to this interpretation question. I guess one of the things about this process is that it's very engaging for our park managers. One of the potential risks about that though is that there can be potential bias, and so again we'll talk a little bit about in this process about some of the ways that you can reduce some of that bias from staff. Probably one of the biggest ones is that whole area of organisational culture. And organisational culture is sometimes difficult to measure, but if it's not an evaluation culture, it's really going to be very, very challenging. One of the things that we've often found is that there are still staff that think that management effectiveness evaluation is all about reporting to somebody else. What we're trying to do is really turn that into an organisational and institutional culture where evaluation is just normal business. And finally, this question around meaningfulness and the potential risk about disconnection from normal business. And again, we'll talk about how we can improve those processes. So I'll talk about the first couple of ways to mitigate some of those potential risks. I guess the first thing is being really clear in your survey design from the first place. It's very much around understanding why on earth are you collecting this information. I think many of us will have experience that we are probably collecting a bit too much information, and if you don't use it, you have to really think about why you're collecting it and putting people through the effort of actually going through that process. The survey design process is also about clarity. The park managers, the scientists and whatever that are helping us feed this process really do need clarity. Part of the other process is that we're actually making sure that in terms of interpretation, guidelines, we've got very, very clear guidelines to help our park managers and make sure that everybody is actually understanding what we're trying to achieve. One of the areas that is also a potential risk is that there's a lot of information collected, and the danger is that information can't be analysed in the way that you might like it to be. So one of the things that we've been working on in both organisations over the last few years is trying to make sure that we have reliable, robust information systems, not only to actually structure and enter the assessment data well, but also be able to get that data out in as easy as possible way. And so what we've been doing is looking at some common data standards, particularly making sure that we've got good, stable information systems, web-based systems that we enter this information into, and also using some of the quite useful and sometimes relatively cheap reporting tools where you can extract the data out of these databases and turn it into meaningful information. I'm going to hand across to Andrew now to talk about mitigating some of the other risks and how we do that.
The irony of this is that myself and Tony were both of the view that if either one of us didn't turn up, the other could equally talk about all of it, because it's been very much the same experience across both agencies. So I guess the third part of some of the ways in which we've been viewing mitigating risks is around making sure the actual process of it works properly. For us, a key element, as Tony identified, is that you're not just doing evaluation for reporting. It's, for us, a very strong focus on how are we using it to inform management. So that survey process is really important with a view towards, if we're going to get quality data, how do we get good quality data in and good quality decision-making stuff out at the other end. So throughout the survey process, once we've got a good system in place, we've taken considerable steps to make sure that we have extensive training and help with the team that's running the program, available staff to be able to check in and make sure that they're answering the questions and doing the work in the way that will best benefit them at the other end. Throughout the entire process, before, during and afterwards, we've gotten extensive feedback from our actual protected area managers themselves. What worked, what didn't work, and how do we improve upon that? And in that way, the entire evaluation process itself is continuing to evolve over time. We've tried to ensure that we consistently capture or reflect different types of evidence. As Tony said, the qualitative versus quantitative argument is a little bit short in some ways, in that you have different information to suit different purposes. In New South Wales, we undertake evaluations of 860 plus reserves every 3 years. There is a question of how much quantitative data we can get for every question. We also make sure that any individual manager responsible for the protected areas is the one that has ultimate responsibility for actually completing the evaluation. One of the things that we'll often find in a project, if there is not a single point of responsibility at the end, then it's a collection of everybody going, well, I sort of did my bit, but I'm not necessarily verifying the end point. So we've had a single point manager who's responsible for it, and then we're assuring accountability through ensuring senior managers sign off through a couple of different levels. And then that supports moderation if required as well. For some people that are a little bit excited and having a very positive day, sometimes they answer a little bit too enthusiastically. Likewise, the vice versa may be true. It's great when you've got all the data in, rubbish in, rubbish out, as we've often said. So we've tried to make sure that we audit through the data as robustly as we can afterwards without going overboard. In New South Wales and Victoria, we undertake the surveys from about July in any given year through to around November, December by the time it's done. If you want to completely audit the entire data set and have it meaningfully ready to inform a financial year business planning for the following year, that means you've got about 3.5 months to analyse all of the data and get it into a format that you're confident has high quality audits associated with it. As you go through some of that, we look for areas where the inconsistency is likely to be greatest. If there's incorrect data that's been compiled, if somebody says a negative result in some way, we usually follow up with a phone call with them and say, tell us a little bit more about that if they haven't given us a good enough answer. We might only get through 50% of them perhaps before our time runs out, and we'll have to follow it up again a little bit later, but we'll have gotten through quality improving it all as we've gone along. We've seen it as a very collaborative exercise. So that way when we follow up with them, we're exploring not only that issue but also the context around it. An opportunity to get feedback on one case where they say impacts are increasing might be a 10-minute conversation because you go and elicit a whole heap more information associated with it. One of the last things that we'll put in there is to keep it relevant. So it's not just about reporting, it's about returning the data. And in both of our agencies, we've gone to extensive efforts to make sure that we continue to interact with the managers that are on the ground managing our protected areas. It's great to bring all of the information together, but if you're not feeding it back to those protected area managers in a way that suits them, then they're not really going to buy in and the culture's not going to change around evaluation. So when we've been looking at how we've evolved the program and how we've returned some of the data, we've been looking about how we apply the results for strategic planning. What are the key issues that are emerging? We have an approach to law enforcement, for example. How successful has that been? And if it hasn't been successful in patches, what are we going to do about it from a strategic level to actually boil it down and establish some clear responses that we can go with that? I'm sure many of you within your own agencies have a sense of operational planning or business planning in some way that identifies an annual set of works that you undertake. We make sure that this feeds into that cycle periodically so that way the evaluation is actually responding to the performance and to the issues. We also feed it into our management plans, and we also utilise it, are increasingly using it to inform KPI indicators for the organisation overall. So there's some very key things to think about how you actually utilise the information to inform all elements of planning. And it doesn't have to be overwhelmingly complex. When you bring it all together and you start to get some messages, it's as much as anything else about the conversations you have with those on the ground and how you decide that you're going to respond to it. So I guess our three key take-home messages were about developing an evaluation culture and getting down and looking at the detail of it, making sure that you connect monitoring to monitoring, evaluation and effectiveness evaluation programs as you go along. Many of our data sets are underpinned by quantitative information, but it's a qualitative assessment that's actually utilised to focus our response to that. And to ensure that if you do have qualitative information, it's quite data rich in that regard. So, anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, look, I think one of the real challenges for us is that we are doing a lot of quantitative and field-based monitoring programs, and we are, I guess, reviewing a lot of those around making those monitoring programs much more objective-based rather than just going out and counting something. And I think a real challenge for us now is to actually, knowing that we are collecting field-based information, how do you translate the knowledge from that field-based quantitative assessments through, particularly in relation to condition of environmental values and outcomes, how do you translate that into the knowledge that park staff can use and that park managers can use, but also making sure that it's actually relevant to management and relevant to reporting in terms of being able to report against the organisation's goals. Thank you.